Welcome everyone to the case construction session that's going to be held by Aayana Rai Bhojani. I think this session is going to be extremely useful for all of us as debaters as to how to make better case and how to tackle our opposition. Before I hand over the mic to Aayana, a brief introduction about them. Aayana is a third-year student at the School of Law at Christ University. They are a senior debater and broke as a speaker in the open category at the 2021 Bali UADC, 2021 Nepal Australs, and 2020 Malaysia Australs Women. They have also won multiple PDs, including the Annual Premchand Memorial PD 2021, the MIT Debate Tournament 21, Delhi Pre-Australs 21, among others. They are also the CA for RML PD and Vitark DDUC PD. And from personal experience, I can tell you that there's nobody better than them to teach you case constructions as I've faced them in previous rounds of debate. So without any further ado, Aayana, you can take it away.
Thank you guys so much for that introduction. So my name is Aayana, as I'm sure you've already heard. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about case construction. So I am a bit technologically challenged. So if you need to ask me questions, please just unmute yourself and feel free to stop me anytime. Cool. So I'm going to talk about three things today. First, I'm going to talk about like what you would need to do in prep time before you get into the debate, because I think that what I've realized over the last 2 years of debating is that a lot of your debates are likely to have been won in prep time. There's not a lot you will do, especially in APs, to evolve your case when you're debating. I think a lot of that just comes down to like your rebuttal speakers and trusting your second and third, but specifically for your first speeches, I think a lot of it is done in prep time. And then I'm going to be talking to you about how to make your prep time better, actually. The second thing we're talking about is just arguments, like how to understand what the motion demands you to understand and then make your arguments from there. And the third is just going a little bit more depth into those arguments. So specifically talking about what analysis looks like under each argument, how you can make that better, and why it's important to flag what you're doing to your judge. Cool. So on prep time, like I've already said, I think it affects most of what you do in the debate, but I'm going to be starting off really basic. There are just generally two kinds of categories of motions you are most likely to face in any debate tournament that you go to. The first is just action motions, which means that you're required to do something in the debate. For example, it would look like a this House will, which is that you as the House are going to pass a certain policy or you want to implement something, and that's what the debate is about. The second is analysis motions, which is that it requires you to, it assumes that like a world exists and it requires you to either believe in that world or not believe in that world, either support that world or not support that world, either propose an entirely new world or like not propose an entirely new world, right? I'm just going to quickly go over what action motions are likely to look at like at tournaments, just so you get a better idea before I get into the depth of my workshop. So the first kind of action motion that you are most like that you will get is a this House will motion. So this specific slide talks about a this House will ban drugs motion, in which case you're going to need to talk about like multiple different things, one of which can just be obviously it is important in your like first speech itself to tell like the judge what kind of drugs you're banning. So that could look like recreational drugs, it could look like medicinal drugs. Obviously what is most likely to be valuable in that particular debate is banning recreational drugs, because if you try and ban medicinal drugs, you're just honestly setting yourself up for a huge burden. I think the second thing that you can probably tell your judge, which is what's called modeling in debates, is how you're likely to implement this ban. So is it going to be through a government? Is it going to be through individual pharmaceutical shops? What is it likely to look like? Can people access some drugs or can they not access drugs at all? I think the second is just an actor motion, which is this House as an actor would do a certain task. So in this specific slide here, we're talking about this House as the US would disengage from Afghanistan. So like perhaps, sorry, this is a bit of an outdated example, but perhaps you can do it in one of two ways. First, you can like talk about how you disengage like currently, like would you disengage in like a phased manner, or would you provide like any future support to Afghanistan after you disengage or not, right? Quickly moving on. Analysis motions look like things like a belief stack motion, which especially requires you to prove like the truth value of a debate. So in this particular slide, we're talking about this House believes that Facebook has done more harm than good. In this case, it is literally just as simple as, I think, school debating that some of you guys probably have encountered, which is some things are good and some things are bad. You just need to weigh out why the good outweighs the bad or the bad outweighs the good, depending on the side of the motion that you're on. The second is a this house regrets debate. So it's a post facto debate. Something has already happened in this particular situation and you regret the happening of that thing. So what's really important is that if you're regretting something in isolation, it's probably not going to work. You would want to propose what's called a counterfactual in absence of like the US withdrawing from Afghanistan. What do you think is more likely to occur? Would they have like stayed? And like what's also important to note is that you need to prove the likelihood of that counterfactual. So it's not just enough to assert that there are existing counterfactuals in this world. It's also important to prove that these counterfactuals are likely to occur in this particular like world we're talking about. So just really quickly, just so I know like the sort of level that we're kind of talking about in today's workshop, would you guys just maybe be able to like put in chat, literally just one of you is fine, what you think these kind of these motions are, like are they action motions, are they analysis motions? Okay, I am not sure if people are talking on the chat because I can't see it. Great. Okay, I see something. The first one is an analysis motion. That's correct. First two are analysis. Yep. So the third one is seems like, so I'm going to explain the third one a little more to you because I think it can get a little bit confusing. In a belief that motion, regardless of what you are doing, it is still likely to be true that you need to argue like the truth value of the motion, which is it good that government should provide financial incentives like this? Or would you not want the governments to provide financial incentives like this? And would you rather a government do something separate with the limited capital that it has? So it's not that the government today is probably going to do things like financial incentives. It's likely that at some point in the near future, we would want this. But before that, we would just decide whether it is a good or a bad thing before like the implementation of the motion in and of itself happens. So I think the way to understand this is just that there's certain categorization of motions. And it is likely that most believe that motions would be analysis motions where you would need to provide analysis as opposed to how the government is going to do significant financial incentives, like to move people from rural areas to urban areas, right? Or urban areas to rural areas, whichever. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, cool. So now I just want to get into a little bit more depth in terms of like what prep time is likely to look like. Just want to flag that obviously there are incredibly different ways of doing prep time. I'm specifically going to be talking about what works for me and my partner. And hopefully that's going to work for you. But I will also like, if you guys would like, flag other ways of doing prep time that I've seen debaters around me do. And perhaps you can just pick the one that works best for you. So I think the first thing to do in prep time is to figure out what your burdens are. So just to make it clear, what burdens are is just to decide what your burdens are. At least you need to understand the most basic things about the motion. So it is fine to take like 2 minutes to understand what the motion requires you to do, because often you can get incredibly like complex motions that you do not know, and you don't know what the real change in the motion is. So that's the first thing, right? Figure out what the change is, which is what is a government supposed to be proving and what is an opposition supposed to be proving. And is there a difference in the two? Because if you're reaching like similar impacts, there's likely to be, you know what you need to focus on, which is if both government and opposition want to prove that probably like a criminal goes to jail at the end, at like the end of committing a crime, but government says we would want to do it through retribution, and like opposition says we would want to prioritize rehabilitation. Those are obviously very, very different ways of reaching the exact same impact at the end. So you need to weigh out what that way is and why that's likely to be better than opposition's way. I think the second thing is just like proving your mechanisms, which is, it is always easy, at least I would say it's easier to figure out the first, which is what you want to change by the motion, but it is not as easy to figure out how you're likely to change the motion or how you're likely to be able to get some amount of like difference in that you're trying to achieve, right? And I think that the way to do this is to just think about like the most basic things in terms of figuring out how you as an individual, like perhaps just putting yourself in place of the actor, if it's an actor debate, would want that change to occur, or what your like incentives for making that change occurring is. I'm going to explain this a little bit later in the like later part of my presentation, but I think you can just like figure out that like a how question is really, really important to answer. I think the third thing is, this is the way to do this, which is just question each other. So if your partner is making an argument and you're not entirely sure that that argument comes into construction, or alternatively, you are incredibly sure that that alternative comes into construction, but you can see why an opposition team would argue that that's unlikely to occur. It is really, really important to prove the why of what you're saying is true, which is the likelihood analysis of something coming into construction or not coming into construction. The last thing, and this is more specifically for actor motions or for motions that are affecting really, really specific individuals. So for example, the LGBTQ community, it is really important to figure out what this community is likely to want and how they're likely to move forward with their goals that they have. So it's important to decompose actors. What I mean is the LGBTQ community isn't comprised just in isolation. I think it's likely to like exist in worlds where you're probably going to have conservative majorities, or it's likely to exist in worlds where not everybody who identifies as LGBTQ can opt into the community, right? So you really need to care about other individuals that are likely to just be affected by this motion and how they're going to be affected by the motion. I think the second thing that you need to do in prep time, which moves into the second part of my presentation, is the argumentation in and of itself. So cool. I just want to have two like very clear objectives before we get into like a bunch of exercises. The first is that it can be often confusing to figure out like specific terms in the motion. So for example, I think in a recent tournament, I just saw a motion about like the GERD, which is the Grand Ethiopian like dam, which is just like a dam that exists between Ethiopia and Egypt. And it's like probably an incredibly confusing like topic to get, especially if you don't know like anything about IR, which I often fall into. I think the best thing to do in situations like this is to just like perhaps make it clear what you would think it looks like in like terms that are familiar to you. So maybe you know that like dams in India exist. Are they going to be good dams? Are they going to be bad dams? And is there likely to be just in general political like changes over the dams? Is there likely to be just in general infighting between communities over dams? And then just sort of extract the knowledge that you already know and apply to the motion. I can assure you like 90% of the time this is likely to work. The 10% you're in top rooms, probably just take a loss and like make up the next round, right? The second thing I want to talk about is that not every motion is going to require you to change everything about the world. Like there are probably things that people are going to prioritize in those in debates. Those are likely to be called clashes, which you possibly have seen before, just adjudicators framing themselves around, or possibly you've just like figured out that like generally most teams are going to be talking about a couple of issues, right? I think those are the issues that you really need to focus your like prep time around. So for example, in this house will break up big tech. Probably most teams are going to be talking about things like privacy, things like, is it likely that big tech is going to reconsolidate after you break it up? Possibly even things like what is the world going to look like without it? Are you still going to have some kinds of monopolies? Is monopoly in general good or bad? I think these are just three things that you know are likely, and you can preempt from prep time, are likely to be what the debate revolves around. So you should also focus the majority of your time on these things in prep time. So really quickly, I'm going to talk about two things here. The first is just a path to victory. So this can sound like an incredibly complex term, but what it really means is one of two things. Either it means that you can prove something that your other, like the other side in the debate can't, or it means that perhaps both teams can prove it to some extent, but you can prove it better, you can prove it faster, you can prove it with more likelihood, or you can prove it with more certainty that it's going to get the impacts that you want. So understanding this at the very top of your like prep time is probably what's likely to be able to make you structure your prep time better around it. So just really quickly, in a motion that says this house will punish attempted and committed crimes equally, what do you think is the most likely like path to victory on either side of the house? So on government first.
I think probably on the government side, it would be like intent to commit the crime was the same. And just because it couldn't be carried out properly or successfully does not mean that they wouldn't do it again or wouldn't have done it that time.
No, absolutely. That's completely correct. So what do you think is the most likely impact of that? So if you consider like somebody that's attempted to commit murder as similar to somebody that's committed murder, what do you think the impact of that on society is likely to be? So just to sort of simplify it, is society going to commit more crimes? Is society going to commit less crimes after that?
Lesser crimes, I mean, on the government side, you should say that it'll be lesser.
Absolutely. So I think that the important thing to flag is that it is pretty obvious in a criminal justice motion that having less crimes or having less criminals or in general having less victims is probably what's important. And this is not true just of this motion, it's true of most criminal justice motions that you are likely to get. So I think just figuring out different themes and just figuring out what your most likely way to win a debate is probably what's going to be called a path to victory. So in this case, in government side, it's probably going to be okay if we punish like attempted and like committed crimes exactly the same way, less people are going to even attempt to do crimes because they know that they're going to go to jail for a longer time. Obviously, jail is something that's not desirable. So we would just prioritize that in terms of like the deterrence that people have to committing crimes. What do you think is the most likely op push to this? So again, to simplify it, is op going to say no, people will still commit crimes, or is op going to say no, we don't think this is a fair way to like run the criminal justice system?
They'll argue that it's not a fair way to run the criminal justice system.
Yeah, and why do you think that that might be true? Like, why do you think that it's not a fair way to run the criminal justice system?
Because there's no legal procedure with regard to the crimes which have not been committed. So people can be falsely accused and there will not be a formal procedure as to, put them in jails, etc. So there will be a lot of false accusations and under trials of sorts.
For sure. So that's really smart. But I think that, for example, if you had a government in this debate, that's like, we would have this legal procedure in order to be able to establish attempted crimes. We would probably, because it's a this House will motion, they have the ability or like the fiat to model out the debate to say like, obviously we think that going forward, we would implement a legal framework where you can like see what the attempted crime is, and then you can like construe what you think is a likely like punishment for it, and it's going to be exactly the same as committed crimes. So in the case that a government says we have the legal framework, what do you think is the situation?
They'll probably argue that no harm has actually been caused, so they can't be punished for that.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I feel like that could be one of the ways in which opposition could go forward with this motion. They can say probably there's no harm that's committed, and you can't actively ascertain the ways in which people want to attempt to commit crimes, because generally there's no way to figure out what a thought process behind like an individual committing a crime is, and therefore it's really not easy to criminalize them and criminalize their conduct. Often you're like, and I'm going to reach the exact same impact that I think Ayushi reached earlier, which is that you're going to have a lot of innocent people going into jail because perhaps they didn't mean to commit the crime that actually ended up being committed, or ended up being committed because it's an attempted crime. Cool. So I think that now that that's clear, and we're sure that the path to victory on government is proving that there's less crimes, and the path to victory on opposition is proving that it is not a fair way to run the criminal justice system. Let's quickly move on to like what it looks like to add analysis. So here's what I'm going to go a little bit more in depth. So in a motion that reads, this House believes that the media should not take institutional stances on the innocence or guilt of people who have been charged with a crime, but not yet convicted or acquitted, which is just in simplified like terms, should the media talk about a criminal while like a criminal case is being like judged upon in court? What do you think is the most, so we're just going to discuss Gov. What do you think is the path to victory to Gov in this particular debate?
Just to try, but I think I would focus upon the stakeholder analysis, and like the most marginalized communities are the ones which face the brunt of it, because they did not receive any form of protection. For example, if this was in the US, and I would say that, look, if Black people are more incarcerated and they have not, they still, you don't know if they're guilty or innocent, still the media would put forward them in a light whereby they would still be discriminated.
Yeah, so that's really, really good, right? But I think that the thing that I want to flag straight off the bat is that the media portraying somebody as innocent or guilty, um, you need to show that there is active impacts on the ways in which the judgment is made. So it is pretty likely to be true that a judge will buy your analysis of the media is biased towards majorities, but it is not likely to be true that the judge is going to buy your analysis, especially in face of an op telling you that we think judges specifically, like judges in courts specifically, get training to like overcome their biases. They're probably being accountable in some ways to the ways in which they give judgments. They probably need to explain themselves to their voter bank, etc. In that case, your adjudicator in the debate is not going to think it's incredibly intuitive that the media is going to affect an individual whose career depends on giving the right call. So what do you think you can do? So while that is the path to victory, the path to victory is definitely, it could definitely, at least one of them could be in this specific like scenario, proving why the most vulnerable are hurt. How do you specifically show that in terms of showing that a judgment is actively swayed by the media?
I think we could also talk about, how sometimes there is a jury system and that can be influenced.
Yeah, okay, so that's fair, and I'm just gonna like extrapolate even from that into the judge system as well. So I think the first is obviously that I think the media represents the intuitions of the most of the majorities, or at least they try to, because that's the way in which they're going to make money, or that's the way in which they're going to reach out to the most number of people. In that case, especially when you have a jury system, you are most likely to be representing individuals that come from majority situations that so particularly because the media is representing this is something that the jury is likely to know. And I can see why that could be a very, very intuitive link. But particularly because this is a criminal justice motion, obviously you would have some semblances of laws that you can't argue are unlikely to be true on either side. So I think a semblance of this law would look like the jury is just not being able to look at like newspapers at the point at which they're probably like going into court, or at the point at which they're representing courts, or like representing like the decision of a court in any situation. But this doesn't apply symmetrically to judges, particularly because these are individuals that have gone over and like overcome these biases. Overcome like training for biases in the past, which means that most of this debate is likely to be central to what a judge is going to think of this particular victim, or what a judge is not going to think of this victim. So I think that like things that I flagged earlier, for example, a judge being accountable to their voter base, assuming that most of these individuals are majorities, like you guys have already pointed out, probably the media is going to be biased towards the vulnerable. Do you think that their voter base is going to be vulnerable, the vulnerable community in any way? Or do you think it's more likely that the voter base is going to be a majoritarian community? Okay, so I'm just going to go over this again, just so I'm clear with what I'm asking you. The question is, we've already established that media narratives are biased towards majoritarian narratives. They're likely to not affect the most vulnerable they're likely to affect the most vulnerable in really, really biased ways that do not favor them. If that's the situation, do you think then, and we've also established that judges rely on voter-based incentives because a lot of them get re-elected back into power, or a lot of them like pander to governments in a lot of ways. Do you think it's likely to be true that the people that they pander to, or the voter base that they really want to cater to, is going to be majoritarian, or is it going to be a voter base from specifically the vulnerable communities? Okay, so I see something in the text. Yeah, cool. You're right. It is definitely majority based, in which case that's your analysis number one, which is that judges know that they're accountable to individuals that are from majorities. So that would look like a white individual that probably feels like they are being harmed by just Black individuals that are likely to believe that every Black individual that has existed, especially if we're talking about conservative whites, that have existed in like areas around them, they need to be protected from these Black individuals. And the only way in which you can do this is either through the police or through like a judiciary. And therefore, really, really push that judge to give a verdict that puts this Black person away in prison. That is, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide and perhaps we can discuss it a little more in detail. Wait, why is my computer not working? Yeah, cool. So I think that generally when I looked at this motion, there are two things that we can flag. The first is far-reaching impacts, which is it doesn't depend on the victim, it doesn't depend on this particular case, but it depends on specifically what individuals think about like the decisions that judges make. So to do this, you need to specifically prove that media trials exclusively influence judges' decisions. It is not enough to say that judges are going to be biased towards majorities. It is not enough to say that judges cater to voter bases of majorities, because that is likely to accrue on both sides of the house. It is really, really important to show that the media extensively sways the ways in which judges cater to voter bases of majorities. So I think the way to particularly do this in this debate is to just say that I think the media in and of itself represents a lot of majorities. Often you're going to have majorities that are divided on issues like whether a Black person should go to prison or not, because even in white majorities, you're going to have some people that think that are liberal, that believe that Black individuals should be given rights to fair trial similar to every other individual. And the other people that believe perhaps that Black individuals deserve a right to fair trial, but are inherently biased towards believing that they are most likely to be guilty in that particular situation. If that's true, the media is most likely to cater to a voter base that they've been catering to so far, which are conservative majorities, particularly because all across the world, you're going to have conservative majorities, but also it's reflective in the judiciary system. Like, for example, in the United States, currently you have a 5-4 conservative majority, right? In that specific situation, the reason that a judge gets swayed by the media specifically is because of the fact that the media recognizes that these are conservative voter bases, and like these are conservative parts of our voter base, or conservative parts of our viewership that we want to recognize, because these are individuals that are likely to continuously buy our papers, even when we talk about other issues that are likely to be conservative, because that's how we frame our like issues, or that's how we frame like the journalists that give out content. In that particular scenario, the way in which a judge would work is to just pander to media, because it's the way in which they are able to effectively ascertain what the public thinks about that specific crime, because there's no way for a judge to go out on the street and like start taking polls and things like that. Obviously, that's like interfering with the judicial process. So the media is exclusively the ways in which the judge decides the delta between deciding or like the change between deciding to decide that this person is innocent to decide that this person is guilty. Really quickly, I want to flag why that specific like piece of analysis is a path to victory. I think that obviously what comes out of that is that you don't get incredibly like valuable decisions, or you get incredibly biased decisions. This is in general bad, because I think citizens, regardless of whether you're from the majority, regardless of whether you're from the minority, heavily rely on the judicial system to be able to give them fair decisions, because they have no means of doing that themselves beyond taking matters in their own hand, retribution, which again is just in general punished by the criminal justice system, right? If that's true, and the state believes that in certain like scenarios, like violence is justified. For example, if you've killed somebody, violence is justified. That is fair. But in other scenarios where you haven't really committed that crime, the violence of putting you in jail, or the violence of like probably hanging you, etc., is obviously not justified, which means that the rights that you surrender to be able to take matters into your own hand are going to be abrogated by the criminal justice system as a whole, because of the fact that you did not give them the right to arbitrarily decide to punish you. I'm going to stop here. Does anybody have any specific questions about this path to victory or any of the analysis we've discussed so far? You can unmute or just text on chat, or even like privately message me, and I won't read out your names if that could be an issue. Great. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everyone is on the same page, and we'll just move on to the next slide. Yikes. Uh-oh. Yeah, cool. So I think the second thing that possibly a government could need in this, could do in this particular debate is to prove that victims are worse off, which is not just on the outcomes of the judicial system, but also in the process of the media covering them. Because note that that is entirely like independent of your first argument of judges getting swayed, because even if judges don't get swayed, even if they're incredibly objective, and you have a really good op that knows every way in which judges get like get training to overcome biases, or like probably know why the judge is going to be accountable in a vast majority of cases, you need to have a even if, which is even if you are able to prove that the judge is objective, that this is still a harmful process. I think the way to do this is to probably prove that there is likely to be victim suffering. So just really quickly on chat, what do you think this victim suffering could look like? So I flagged on the presentation that it looks like lesser sympathy or solidarity, but what do you think that look like? What in what scenarios do you think that that's possible?
I think an example that came to my mind after listening about victim suffering was when there was the O.J. Simpson case going on, there was no proper verdict to it. No one knew what was happening. But due to the media trial that was happening and the entire research that media was doing on their own, leaving the actual evidences, a lot of the people were swayed to believe that he, even though not proven guilty, was guilty. So he didn't get any kind of support from the media, did not get any kind of support from anyone. Moreover, further on, it also harmed his career because, of course, with the image that was degrading, he wasn't able to get any deals or any work also later on. So even though he wasn't proven guilty or wasn't actually, there was no proof for his guiltiness here, he still suffered in the form of loss of his career, loss of his character in the public as well, and no one supported him. So like that was one example that came to my mind.
That's definitely like so here's what I just want to go back the earlier part of the presentation. Like examples is really good, especially in terms of helping you understand the analysis. So the analysis that I'm getting from Seher's like specific example of O.J. Simpson is that there are going to be some victims that are declared not guilty, but at the point in which you declare them guilty by media trial, or particularly by the ways in which media portrays them, that has long-lasting impacts on their careers that you can just weigh out as a path to victory by saying that it is a pretty like long-termist change on an individual that has specifically been proven innocent. And this is particularly in the ways in which friends and family look at you, in the ways in which you're able to access future career prospects, in the ways in which even you're able to be seen if you have another case lodged against you, because it's always likely to be true that there is just inherent biases in the ways in which other people look at you, that if you have committed the previous crime and therefore you have committed this crime too. Things like that, right? So it's often that once the judgment is given, victims probably still have some impact. The criminals probably still have some impact on them. But I think the specific like example that I'm looking at is the other side. So assuming that somebody has like committed a crime, assuming that they have are going to be held guilty for it, what do you think the impact on the victim of that crime is by virtue of this trial by media?
I think we've also, I think right now also, given that so many previous cases are coming up, which were given maybe guilty in the past or right now, even if they were or were not guilty for the crime that they committed, a lot of these cases have been coming up and I've been reading about them. So one thing that they all talk about is that even after they get out of jail and are released after serving their sentence, they find it incredibly difficult to find any kind of jobs, not even jobs. They find it incredibly difficult to find a place to live even. They have the parole officers and everything going on. They have to have a very strict schedule. And one of the things that they mainly said was that it was easier to live in jail rather than to come out of jail later on, even after they've been proven guilty and have served their sentence. So of course, jobs, then the way people look at you, as you pointed out. And then your entire livelihood is also uprooted because you don't have a place to live in the first place. Your entire family is not willing to look at you in that sense, or can't look at you the same way before, regardless of whether you actually committed the crime or did not commit the crime.
Yeah, so that's absolutely fair. And again, goes back to analysis of what we think the impact on the criminal is likely to be. So assuming you are guilty and you go to jail and you come out of jail, you are obviously some career prospects are taken away from you. But I think that the general thing I want to flag about this argument is that an opposition team can always attribute it to the ways in which jail occurs, or the ways in which society believes that jail exists, and the fact that it just probably makes criminals more violent, or the fact that you've already committed a crime in the past means you're a bad person, etc. but like I can see why you would think that media trials specifically add to this, because that means that the impacts of your trial are more far-reaching. So even if somebody didn't know that you went to jail in the past, they're likely to know that you have gone to jail because of the fact that the media has covered this. But again, this is all about what happens to the criminal. I'm specifically talking about what happens to the victim, which is that the criminal has committed a crime against a person. When they are being tried in court, what do you think happens to the person that they have committed a crime against, like the victim of the scenario? I see some things. They may have a sense of insecurity. That's, oh God. Yeah, that is completely right. So I'm just going to sort of figure out, like show you what you can impact out of a sense of insecurity. So I think that the way that insecurity can stem is just that the court case might not go in their favor, or it might, but in the process of the media covering this court like case, it is likely that you're going to be asked questions. It is likely that your privacy is going to be abrogated, particularly in a trying time, because you've already had a crime committed against you and you are probably incredibly unhappy about the outcome of that crime, right? In that particular situation, the media, number one, is hounding you for investigative journalism, is hounding you for things like interviews, etc. That is not particularly something that you want to be doing at that time. But two, even if the media in all cases thinks that you, like the person is guilty and that like everybody deserves, like you deserve everybody's support, it is still likely to be true that there are going to be some individuals that do not buy the media's characterization of the criminal, and therefore you're going to have like counter characterizations from other media outlets or counter characterizations from people that have read this media of what you as an individual look like. I think this is particularly true, trigger warning, in sexual assault cases where a woman, even if even if the media believes that the woman has been like hurt in some way or has been assaulted in some way in the past, it is still likely to be true that there are going to be counter characterizations for what this woman is, or what this woman what position this woman is when they were like what position the woman was when they were probably being like sexually assaulted. And that is just bad, because that means that number one, you alienate some supporters that you could have earlier got for this woman, because some of them just think that she's blatantly wrong because of counter characterizations. But number two, there's always a chance that the case is not going to go in your favor. Perhaps you don't have enough evidence to prove it, in which case it becomes even worse for all future like victims that want to come up and talk about crimes, because everyone is like, look, in the past we thought that this crime had occurred and we gave you the sympathy and support, and then the judge ruled that it hadn't, which means that it has long lasting impacts on individuals. So I think that like the path to victory that I just want to flag for this particular argument is that obviously the victims are the individuals we should really care about in the criminal justice system, because they're the ones that have like some of their rights have been violated, or all of their rights have been violated by virtue of the crime being committed against them. Insofar as that's true, and we as a state want to protect rights of people by virtue of just giving them rights, but by also punishing people that abrogate those rights, we also owe an obligation to make it right by them. And the way in which we make it right by them is by giving them like space, probably by giving them the ability to express themselves in court without constantly being questioned by alternative like methods through like the media, for example, about whether the crime has actually been committed against them or not. So just to make this whole path to victory like a lot more crystallized, I've given you a bunch of like metrics that you can use to figure out whether your path to victory is a legitimate one or not. I will note that this like list is not very is not exhaustive. There are a bunch more metrics that you can probably use, but these are the ones that I think are the most frequent in debates. Maybe you'll have off situations where you can't use either of these, in which case, I mean, the path to victory might be a little more difficult in that scenario. And if you guys want, we can discuss that. But just for right now, so the first is a numeracy. So which is, are you going to be affecting the most number of people in this debate? So assuming that you are in the motion we just discussed, assuming that you are a victim, assuming that you are government, are you going to be affecting the most number of victims as opposed to opposition that will probably affect like people's right to know or people's right to information? So in which case are you affecting the most number of people? It is probably like to be people's right to information that you are going to be affecting, because there are more people that are just standards in society, then there are people that are victims. So in that situation, you realize that numeracy is not a metric that you can win by. So you move on, right? I think the second metric that you can possibly talk about is a likelihood of like your outcomes, like your impacts happening. So is it likely that in all scenarios, the judge is going to be objective, or is it likely that in all scenarios, the judge is going to be subjective? This is a pretty clear clash in the debate, because obviously you will want to claim that the judge will be subjective and AUP will want to claim that the judge will be objective. So really figuring out in like prep time that the way in which you make that claim is probably what's going to win you the debate is what's called likelihood analysis. And that's like a weighing metric that you could use. I think the third is a special duty of an actor. So perhaps you care about some people more than you care about others. So in a motion about like feminism, for example, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to run an argument about how men are going to feel threatened by a feminist movement. It would probably make a lot more sense that we would want to protect women by virtue of just being the feminist movement. So you obviously have special duties towards women in that scenario. So affecting the actor that is most likely to be an actor that is contested in the debate is a way to like win the debate. The fourth is just consent. So actually, I'll just come back to this, but the fourth is just consent. I think that like perhaps you have consented to a certain action to happen. So in all scenarios, probably you haven't consented to a crime happening, but in alternative motions, you might have consented to probably going into the army, in which case it might be legitimate that your death has occurred by virtue of you consenting to going into the army, because that's something that you know has happened. So opposition can't truly claim that like the death of soldiers, while is bad, is not a claim that you can win a debate on in terms of like banning the army, for example. I think the fifth thing is the reversibility. So a decision that you make, is it a reversible decision? So this can be like true in terms of like death debates, for example. So would you like perhaps a situation where we are discussing the consent of individuals to go into the army, whether it should be done by just like mass recruiting, or whether it should be done by like things like lottery. So in this case, obviously an opposition can make an argument that like by lottery is specifically a bad way to make this to get people into the army, because it's a choice that people can't reverse once they're in the army. And it's also a choice that people can't reverse once they're dead. And therefore we ought to let people consent to the choice before they make the choice. So it's just about a reversibility versus irreversibility of the outcomes. The sixth thing I want to talk about is the intensity. So this can occur in one of two ways. Either can occur in the intensity of a harm. So you're able to prove a really, really intense harm in terms of you're able to prove that, for example, in a motion that says this house will break up big tech, you're able to prove that in serious scope, people's choices that they make aren't their own choices by virtue of the fact that like the way their interactions with social media actively change their decision-making capabilities. So for example, actively change the ways in which they vote, which is just an intense harm, because these are rights that we think are very, very basic and very, very primary. Alternatively, an opposition can prove that there's an intensity of a benefit, for example, for individuals that don't have access to other types of news or don't have access to other types of communication. And this is something that they truly, truly care about, because it's a way for them to keep in touch with their friends and things like that. So just an intensity of a harm versus an intensity of a benefit, trying to figure out whether your path to victory is either of those. Really quickly, I'm going to stop and go back to like what I wanted to ask you guys earlier. Which of these things, like any of these six things, do you think most applies to either of the two path to victories that we have spoken about in like the two previous slides? So I'm just going to go back to the previous slides. Why does this keep happening? Yeah, here we go. So I think that I flagged the path to victory in brown. What do you think either of these six metrics would apply to that particular path to victory? So if you had to condense that entire path to victory of brown into like 3 words, which of these metrics would you pick? I see an answer in the chat box. Numeracy. Okay, cool. So I just want, so if you feel comfortable unmuting, or if you feel comfortable just anyway, putting on text, would you be able to explain to me why you think numeracy is a metric that government can win by in this particular debate? Cool. So someone said reversibility, likelihood, and special duty. Just gonna go back to those slides. Cool. So why do you think likelihood is a metric for this particular path to victory? So why is citizens surrendering their ability to use violence a likelihood weighing in this debate? Okay, so I don't, okay, wait, no, I do see something in the chat box, but it is not the answer to my question. Cool. So I think that the general thing that I want to flag is that there are some things that are going to be intuitive in debate. So this is just like a social contract principle, which is quite boring to run, but regardless, it's going to be intuitive in most debates that individuals agree that violence is a bad thing, that giving up your rights to violence is a good thing, but that symmetrically means that the state shouldn't use violence against you because you have given up your rights to violence. In which case, it is not, at least I don't see in most scenarios an opposition team arguing that that is not a likely thing to be true, and that is not a likely narrative that people are going to want to follow, because it is likely to be true that they will just concede that people don't want violence used arbitrarily against them. I think what they are most likely to contest is whether the violence is being arbitrarily used against them, which means that you are right in your other two metrics that you flag, which is a reversibility and a special duty. Obviously, once violence has been committed, once you've been put in jail, there are obvious like impacts that you can draw. Number one, just trauma that you are going to face when you're in jail. Number two, just the fact that it's always going to be on your CV, regardless of the fact CV. It's always going to be like on the ways in which you interact with future employers, because even if you are later proved innocent, it is still a stint that you've spent in jail, still probably like inculcated violence of gangs around you and things like that. But thirdly, like if somebody thought you were like guilty at some particular point in time, perhaps you do have violent tendencies or whatever, right? So it's not a very reversible like situation when you put somebody in jail wrongfully. The second thing I want to talk about is the idea of a special duty. You're absolutely right, but it is not true in this. Actually, maybe it might be. I think the special duty that you can flag in both of these arguments truly is the first is that the state owes a special duty towards its citizens because the citizens have voted them into power, because the citizens actively trust them with a lot of their like with managing their own rights or with giving people rights, and therefore it's a special duty you owe to those citizens to make sure that those rights are kept up. Great. So both of those are really, really good like identifications of what weighing metrics could be. I'm going to move on to the second thing, which is the victims one. What do you think are the weighing metrics beyond special duty to actor, which I think is likely to just be true because you have a special duty to victims because they're the ones that have been wronged? What do you think is a weighing metric for this path to victory? So someone said consent. Would you feel comfortable maybe, perhaps it wasn't for this, perhaps it was for the previous one, but would you feel comfortable maybe telling me why you thought consent is a weighing metric that could be used in this debate? Okay, so I'm not seeing any answers on that. So I'll just quickly walk you through why consent is probably not going to be a part of this debate. I think neither team will contest that somebody has consented to the crime that they have that has occurred against them. Perhaps that government will run that people have consented to, like the criminals have consented to the consequences of their action, but that might be a better argument to run in the previous motion that we discussed, which is the discussion about whether attempted and committed crime should be treated equally, because you've consented to the consequences of your actions and you recognize that those actions are bad, and therefore you ought to also consent to the punishment of that action regardless of whether it has been attempted or committed. But in this particular debate, I don't think most people are going to contest that consent doesn't exist on victims or consent doesn't consent exists on victims or that consent doesn't exist on criminals. That being said, does anybody have any other ways in which you can weigh out the victim suffering? I'll just move back to the last slide so that you guys can just take a second and maybe go through it.
Or maybe we could also talk about how like a lot of these soldiers might have PTSD, might face PTSD, like after their service in the forces. That could be something.
For sure. So for the specific like motion of should individuals get like recruitment through get recruited in the army through mass recruitment or lottery, the intensity of harm on soldiers is definitely a way to weigh out why specifically a lottery is not a good situation, which is that you need consent to be able to know what you're getting yourself into. Perhaps if you're not interested in the army, you wouldn't really research the consequences of your action of being in the army in the first place. So like an average citizen perhaps would not want to go into the army. But I will also flag that symmetrically it applies in the debate that we were talking about in terms of the media, which is that the intensity of harm is really, really high on the victim at the point at which you also have to deal with the crime, you also have to deal with the fact that a crime has been committed against you, but now you are being made to deal with the media hounding you for personal interviews, with people just generally telling you you're wrong through things like social media, etc. So the intensity of harm multiplies on the victim and the ways in which they feel in that scenario. And therefore, that is a path to victory for you by showing that victims who have already been hurt in the past are going to be hurt by virtue of media continuing to try people and proving whether they're innocent or guilty. Cool, great. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you guys have any questions whatsoever about case construction or anything at all about debating, I hopefully we'll be able to answer it. But go ahead, unmute and shoot.